Lauded be thy name, O thou in whose hands is the kingdom of all names, and in the grasp of whose might are all that are in heaven and all that are on earth. I entreat thee, by him who is thy most effulgent name, whom thou hast made a target for the darts of thy decree in thy path, O thou the King of eternity, to rend asunder the veils that have shut off thy creatures from the horizon of thy glory, that haply they may turn their faces in the direction of thy mercy, and draw nigh unto the dayspring of thy loving kindness. Leave not thy servants to themselves, O my Lord. Draw them through the influence of thine utterances unto the dawning place of thine inspiration, and to the fountain of thy revelation, and to the treasury of thy wisdom. Thou art he to whose strength and power all things have testified, whose purpose nothing whatsoever of all that hath been created in thy heaven and on thy earth hath been able to frustrate. Render then victorious, O my God, thy servants who have set their faces towards thee, and directed their steps to the seat of thy grace. Send down then upon them what will keep them safe from the danger of turning to anyone but thee, and from fixing their eyes upon aught else except thyself. Potent art thou to do what thou willest, and to rule as thou pleasest. There is no God but thee, the God of glory and wisdom.
Allah, dear friends, welcome to this evening's program as part of the Divine Plan program. This evening we have the pleasure of having Dr. Firaydoun Javaheri, member of the Universal House of Justice, speaking to us on the topic of opposition and perseverance. Of course, Dr. Javaheri does not need an introduction, as we all know and love him here, as well as Baha'is all around the world. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Firaydoun Javaheri.
Allah, dear friends. When I began to think of what I'm going to share with you tonight on the topic of opposition and perseverance, the first thing that came to my mind was this thought that to think that Baha'u'llah will appear in this world and that the people of the world will accept him and that the society will be transformed according to his vision, and the kingdom of God as envisaged by Baha'u'llah will be established on the earth, and that no one will oppose him, is a very unrealistic thought, to say the least. Then I remember this quotation of the beloved guardian where he refers to the opposition and attacks and persecutions of the Baha'is in the process of spreading the cause of Baha'u'llah as the lifeblood of the cause, saying that it constitutes an inseparable and intrinsic part of its development and growth. So pre-knowledge. So why do we talk about opposition? Is Abdul Baha says pre-knowledge of opposition is very useful in that it assists us to be firm when it occurs. To the friends in the West, when he talked about the progress of the faith, he said, this, the coming of opposition, we inform you before it occurs, so that when the hosts of people arise against you for my love, be not disturbed or troubled. Nay, rather, be firm as a mountain. So what I would like to do tonight is to talk about why opposition and what is the nature of this opposition and what's the effect of the opposition. And then we would hopefully have time to talk about what should be our attitudes towards it and what is expected of us at the time of opposition. So first, I like to make a distinction between systematic efforts that are being made in the world to eradicate the faith and to uproot it in different parts of the world, from sporadic and occasional attacks to a community, which is most at times and often the result of local circumstances. So I'm going to be focusing more on the systematic efforts of opposition to the faith. In terms of sources of opposition, where would the oppositions come from? Shoghi Effendi says, numerous and powerful have been the forces that have schemed to quench its light and abolish its holy name, both from within and from without, in lands both far and near. So, therefore, we realize here that Shoghi Effendi makes distinction of internal opposition and external oppositions. And I don't think there is time to talk about both. So I would just want to share with you a few points about internal oppositions, examples of it, and then move on into the external oppositions, if you don't mind. Here is what Abdul Baha talks about internal oppositions. He says, the worst enemies of the cause are in the cause and mention the name of God. We need not fear the enemies on the outside, for such can easily be dealt with. But the enemies who call themselves friends and who persistently violate every fundamental law of love and unity are difficult to be dealt with in this day, for the mercy of God is still great. But then he says, but ere long this merciful door will be closed, and such enemies will be attacked with a madness. That's about internal opposition. Enough, I think. But the type of internal opposition are also different, but the major ones that you are all familiar with, I would mention, for instance, the story of Yahya during the days of Baha'u'llah, the rebellion of Muhammad Ali, targeting mostly the Baha'is of the East, and Khairullah, with the focus on the Baha'is of the West, during the days of Abdul Baha. During the days of Shoghi Effendi, we know that Muhammad Ali and the family of Baha'u'llah continued their opposition. But then we had Avare, who focused on the Baha'is of the East, and Sohrab, who focused on the Baha'is of the West. During the days of when the hands of the cause of God were in charge of the affairs of the faith, we know about the claim of Mason Remy. And if you look at all these oppositions that I mentioned, they are essentially related to the question of successions. And really, when you look at them, you see a pattern as if it means that they would all fade away or have faded away, as if it means that they would not exist much longer than the generation in which they actually began and they were initiated. With the establishment of the Universal House of Justice, though the small number of people who followed Mason Remy continued with their activities, but an internal opposition, not directly related to the question of succession, but a different nature, has emerged. In 1999, the House of Justice described this internal opposition with these words: a campaign of internal opposition to the teachings carried on through the use of the internet, differing from attacks familiar in the past, it seeks to recast the entire faith into a socio-political ideology alien to Baha'u'llah's intent. In the place of institutional authority established by his covenant, it promotes a kind of interpretive authority which those behind it attribute to the views of persons technically trained in Middle East studies. The external oppositions, or the source of external oppositions, is described by Abdul Baha in these quotations. He says, "This day, the powers of all the leaders of religions are directed towards the dispersion of the congregation of the All-Merciful and the shattering of the divine edifice. The hosts of the world, whether material, cultural, or political, are from every side launching their assault, for the cause is great, very great." So he talks about, therefore, the source of external opposition, the sources of external opposition being religious, cultural, material, and political forces. Again, it would be difficult to cover all this, so I'm going to just say a few words about each and then move on to focusing on the systematic external religious oppositions. In opposition from the religious orthodoxies, we have seen different forms of it, even though the more serious ones so far have been in Iran and in Egypt, the more systematic ones. Both one from the Shia Islam and one from Sunni Islam. Even though we have seen also oppositions from Christianity and other religions, but these are the main two sources of religious oppositions. In Iran, this opposition began immediately with the declaration of the Bab, and it has continued in the past 160 few years. In mid-50s, this opposition became more systematic with the formation of a group called Hojjatiyeh that was formed with the sole purpose of opposing the Baha'i faith. In Egypt, this systematic opposition was formed in mid-30s and still continues. Shawki Effendi has commented on the opposition from the religious leaders and has made these two very interesting points. He says, "It seems both strange and pitiful that the church and clergy should always be, in every age, be the most bitter opponents of the very truth they are continually admonishing their followers to be prepared to receive. They have become so violently attached to the form that the substance itself eludes them." However, he also makes this other comment on clergies. He says, "We have every reason to hope and believe that in the future, many of the truly enlightened clergy may seek the shelter of Baha'u'llah." So they are a special category. We have to learn how to deal with them. For political oppositions, one can cite, I did not really do a thorough study on this. I just am sharing with you what I remembered. And so for political opposition, and so you may have other examples for each one of these. For political oppositions, I thought of, for instance, the opposition of the Soviet Union and the government of Germany in the past, and maybe North Korea as an example in the present time. Cultural oppositions, even though it is not yet a very solid form of opposition to the faith, but one can think of communities where the views of the faith on issues such as homosexuality or gay marriage may become an obstacle for the progress of the faith. The question of materialism and secularism is a vast one by itself. One can talk a lot about that. but basically materialism with its interpretation, with materialistic interpretation of the nature of human being and the life on this planet, that there is no need for religious intervention for the betterment of the world, that the betterment of the world can come through material development, and so on. Shoaib Effendi talks about as a formidable obstacle for the progress of the cause. And therefore, it is a form of obstacle that we probably deal with it all the time. In a letter in 1936, Shoaib Effendi describes an interesting interaction between some of these sources of external oppositions. He explains, for instance, that how in the future the forces of irreligion and materialism will consolidate itself in the world and will invade some of the most powerful Christian institutions in the West. And how, in turn, these institutions will become increasingly restless, moving backwards, losing their inherent strength and their discipline, and will regard with despair and anxiety the rise of the Baha'i faith, and will gradually determine to oppose it. And then he explains how such an opposition in turn will accelerate the decline of these Christian institutions. So having said these few words, for the rest of my talk, I would focus on the systematic opposition from the religious orthodoxies, noting that most of what we would consider actually applies to the other type of oppositions. So why opposition? Why opposition to a loving, peaceful Baha'i faith? That will be a good question. Here is an answer from Shoaib Effendi. He says, this cause, as every divine cause, cannot be effectively established unless it encounters and valiantly triumphs over the forces of opposition with which it is assailed. Trials and persecutions have always been and will continue to be the lot of the chosen ones of God. So one reason, it's God's tradition. The cause of God cannot effectively progress and be established. Now, wouldn't you say this is strange? Is this not amazing? That with all powerful God, his cause cannot be established without opposition? This is what Abdul Baha says. He says, and the amazing thing is this. He calls it amazing thing. And the amazing thing is this, that the most effective means whereby this light of truth is safeguarded and protected is the onslaught of the enemies. So if you think it's strange, Abdul Baha agrees with you. He then gives this beautiful metaphor in which he compares the cause of God once with a light or a lamp and once with a ship sailing in the sea, and the opposition to wind and the waves of the sea, and says the globe of this lamp is the tempestuous winds, and the safety of this ship lieth in the violent tumultuous waves. This is where the amazing thing is. The protection of the light or the lamp of God is the strong winds, and the safety of the ship of the cause of God lies in the strength of the waves of the sea. Shoaib Effendi in God Passes By says, the tribulations attending the progressive unfoldment of the faith of Baha'u'llah, this he talks about the tribulation that has happened to the cause in the first century. The tribulations attending the progressive unfoldment of the faith of Baha'u'llah have indeed been such as to exceed in gravity those from which the religions of the past have suffered. So yes, it's the tradition of God for every religion, but the faith of Baha'u'llah has suffered more. And there are several other quotations indicating that it will suffer more. Well, because Abdul Baha says the cause is great, very great. So what are the reasons for this opposition? And how intense will it be? What is the target for these oppositions? Will it come from? These are the type of questions that I would address now. She says, as the faith grows from strength to strength, the fanatical defendants of the stronghold of orthodoxy, whatever be their denomination, realizing the penetrating influence of this growing faith, will arise and strain every nerve to extinguish its light and discredit its name. So one was the tradition of God, but the other one is, as the prestige of the faith grows, the enemies of the faith will become more nervous and will arise to oppose it. Shoghi Effendi also says that we must realize that as the process of disintegration of society advances, the attacks on the faith will become fiercer. And as the full measure of the stupendous claim of the faith of Baha'u'llah becomes recognized by the religious leaders of the past, and as the authority with which Baha'u'llah has invested the future Baha'i Commonwealth becomes more and more clear for those who are in power and for those whose aim is to maintain their stronghold on the thoughts and conscience of people, the opposition of the faith will be fiercer, more powerful, more insidious, and more cruel. So he says, fierce and manifold will be the assaults with which governments, races, classes, and religions, jealous of its rising prestige and fearful of its consolidating strength, will seek to silence its voice and sap its foundation. It is frightening, but it will come when I would share with you the second paragraph of all these quotations, because then it always follows by a great promise of victory. But you note here that Shoghi Effendi talks about jealousy and fear as the cause of opposition from the religious orthodoxy. Now, let's look at the history of the faith in Iran. The proclamation of the Bab in 1844 in Shiraz, one can say really it electrified the entire country, its people, and its social fabrics, and it rocked the foundation of the country. I have been personally quite fascinated by the speed with which the faith of the Bab, the cause of the Bab, spread throughout Iran. Iran is a very vast country, as you know. At the time of the declaration of the Bab, means of effective transportation and communication was almost non-existent. Stories are available in the history saying that sometimes it was easier if somebody wanted to travel within the country, it was easier for them to cross the border to the neighboring country, travel in the neighboring country, and enter Iran from a border closer to their destination. This is how means of communication, it was poor. Yet, with a handful number of believers, his letters of the living, 18 in numbers. These 18 letters of the living, friends, come from not many localities, not even 10, less than a handful number of localities. And Bab assigned them mostly to their homeland. Go back to your city, go back to your hometown and home province. Yet, in spite of this, before his martyrdom, in the period of 5 to 6 years, the cause of the Bab was spread in every corner of the country. It was heard in everywhere. He had followers in every country. And I have been fascinated by the reasons for it. And I can think of two reasons, one heavenly and one earthly, one worldly. The heavenly reasons, of course, is the cause of the will of God and the power, the transformative and the creative power of the words of God and the cause of the Bab. The earthly reason for it may be the effectiveness of the preparations that the followers of Sheikh Ahmad and Sayyid Kazim did in preparing the people of the world, of Iran, for the coming of the Bab. We all know about the spiritual and social corruption that existed at that time in Iran. So one could say, imagine that the country and its people spiritually were like dead and dry woods. And this preparation of the Sheikh Ahmad and Sayyid Kazim prepared them to catch the fire. And that's exactly what happened. The fire came and it spread like wildfire throughout the country. I'm saying this because I think that to some extent that situation is probably occurring again through sufferings, through the persecutions of the Baha'is, and through the spiritual forces released by this persecution that the Baha'is in Iran have been suffering from. I think the country is prepared, is getting spiritually ready to, or at least a percentage of the population is getting ready. So, and I think it is that outstanding, that extraordinary speed with which the fate of the Bab spread was the cause of creating this fear and this jealousy among the religious leaders. Here is how Shoghi Effendi describes the declaration of the Bab and its effect on the people of Iran. He says the people of Shiraz were by that time wild with excitement. This is shortly after his declarations. A violent controversy was raging in the masjids, the mosques, the madrasa, the religious schools, and the bazaars, and other public places. Peace and security were gravely imperiled. Fearful, envious, thoroughly angered, the mullahs were beginning to perceive the seriousness of their positions. The Universal House of Justice in 2003, addressing the Baha'is of Iran, told them, nor should you have any doubt that it is this same fear that animates the successive waves of persecution you have endured. A few months ago, one of the prominent clerics in Iran, residing in Qom, the most holy city in the country, made a statement to the effect that the danger of the Baha'i faith for Iran is now more serious than 30 years ago before the revolution. The media picked this one up and said, what type of fear is this? What type of danger is this? That 30 years after the government coming stronger and stronger, and the Baha'i community has been under persecution for more intense persecutions in the past 30 years, what type of danger is it that is on increase? And then one of the articles in one of the newspapers said, maybe the danger is the reality that the people of Iran are waking up to the truth of the Baha'i faith And this is what the mullahs see as a danger. So you see the fear and the jealousy that was mentioned by Shaykh Effendi, it's continuous, and as the House of Justice confirmed. Now, as who will oppose the faith, and how will it be done, and what will be the target of the opposition, let me just share with you a few quotes. Shaykh Effendi says, at some future date, a keen antagonism to our faith on the part of those who do not see in it the salvation of the world, but rather a challenge to their own fame and position, will occur. Those who don't see in it salvation of the world, but in it they see a challenge for their own positions. He says, peoples, nations, adherents of diverse faiths will jointly and successively arise to shatter its unity, to sap its forces, and to degrade its holy name. They will assail not only the spirit which it inculcates, but the administration which is the channel, the instrument, the embodiment of that spirit. So, therefore, the target of the opposition will be everything from administration into the teachings of the faith, into the names of the faith, into the prestige of the faith. And let me just quickly read this. Everyone knows this quotation from Abdul Baha, but I thought I would share it still with you, where he says, how great, how very great is the cause, how very fierce the onslaught of all the peoples and kindreds of the earth. Ere long shall the clamor of the multitude throughout Africa, throughout America, the cry of the Europeans and of the Turk, the groaning of India and China be heard from far and near. So he has not left any corner of the world. In another occasion, he says, a large multitude of people will arise against you, showing oppression, expressing abuse, using abusive language, shunning your society, and heaping upon you ridicule. And the Universal House of Justice says the persecution of the Baha'is in Iran recently intensified is ample evidence alone of the determination of the forces of darkness to quench the flame of faith wherever it burns brightly. Though confident in the ultimate triumph of the cause, we dare not forget the warning of the Guardian that the faith will have to contend with enemies more powerful and more insidious than those who have afflicted it in the past. So there is no question, it is quite clear in the writings that we will have oppositions, it will be serious, it will be intense, and it will come from all walks of life. And the reasons for it, I think we have gone through it and it's clear to you. But what will be the effect of the opposition on individuals? Shaykh Effendi says, I like to just quote a few things on the effect of opposition on individuals, on the cause, and on the community, if I get a chance. On the individual, Shaykh Effendi says, opposition to the faith, from whatever source it may spring, whatever form it may assume, however violent its outbursts, is admittedly the motive power that galvanizes, on the one hand, the souls of its valiant defenders, and taps for them, on the other, fresh spring of that divine and inexhaustible energy. So it galvanizes the souls of the believers, and it brings for them inexhaustible energies. How true this is really um, about the story of the Baha'is in Iran. If you ever think that how can really an ordinary human being suffer so much, there is no explanation except this inexhaustible source of spiritual energy that comes as a result of opposition. He further says, viewed in the light of past experience, the inevitable result of such futile attempts, this is the opposition to the cause, however persistent and malicious they may be, is to contribute to a wider and deeper recognition. Opposition contributes to a wider and deeper recognition by believers and unbelievers alike of the distinguishing features of the faith proclaimed by Baha'u'llah. During the past few months, where the persecution of the Baha'is in Egypt has really intensified, and you probably are following all the story of it, and it became more to the attention of the world as a result of a court case ruling in favor of the Baha'is who have been denied their identity cards. There has been a lot of proclamations, but as individuals, we have all of a sudden an increase on the number of people from Arab countries who write to our OPI site and want to know more about the faith. We have had prominent people, such as a judge in Jordan, writing to say he has heard the story and he is interested in a thorough and deep study of the faith. The number of people who are interested to follow their investigation about the faith is so much that we had to actually arrange for a system whereby they would be actually followed up by people who are not here in different countries. We had people in Egypt, individuals, who had written moving accounts of their feelings towards the faith, saying that they have heard the story of the persecution, they have studied as a result the faith, they would like to become Baha'is, even though the moment they become Baha'is, they will be killed by their member of family, and what do you think I should do? So, we have had all sorts of evidences that how this opposition has really created interest among the individuals to understand and distinguish the features of the faith of Baha'u'llah. Very recently, a very well-known Egyptian lady, non-Baha'i, in Egypt, residing in Egypt, well-educated, well-placed in the society, has her own blog and writes about different things. And we didn't know about her blog until she decided on the 17th of October that she would like to write an article about the birth of the Bab on the 20th of October. She did her own investigation. One of the most accurate articles in Arabic we have about the faith is hers. And at the end, she congratulated the birth of the Bab to the Baha'is of the world. This is where it says it galvanizes the spirit of the believers, and it encourages others to investigate the faith. As the effect of opposition on the cause, Baha'u'llah himself says this: such adversity is the oil that feedeth the flame of this lamp. Such is God's transforming power. He changeth whatsoever he willeth. He verily has power over all things. So here Baha'u'llah tells us that God has the power that he can change everything into whatever he willeth. And therefore, he has decided to change opposition into an oil that increases the flame of the light of the cause of God. So wouldn't we want some more oppositions if that was the case? In one of the quotations from Baha'u'llah, using the terminology of human resources that we are using these days, we are more familiar with its utilization these days. he seemed to be looking at both the enemies of the faith and the believers as equal human resources for the progress of his cause. Because he says, "Verily God rendereth his cause victorious at one time through the aid of his enemies, and at another by the virtue of the assistance of his chosen ones." So God has the power to do all this. I'd like to share with you an amazing statement from Shoghi Effendi that he wrote in the early days of his ministry to the Central Assembly of the Baha'is of Iran. He said, "The release of this innocent and wronged community from the bonds of captivity and its deliverance from the clutches of the enemy and oppressor cannot but be accomplished by general commotions and disturbances. Likewise, the attainment by the people of Baha to a position in which they will enjoy true honor, comfort, and tranquility must inevitably encounter the hostility and resistance, the clamorous opposition and tumultuous protest of all those who harbor enmity and rancor towards them." So he leaves no doubt that what earlier on I shared with you, that the establishment of the faith of God, the cause of God, will need opposition. If you look again at the history of the progress of the cause in Egypt, you find that it was through some persecutions of the Baha'is in Egypt that in early 20th century it first was established by an Islamic court as an independent religion, independent of Islam. And the recent persecution of the Baha'is has really caused in a tremendous victory for the faith. The amount of publicity that we have had, not only in Egypt, but throughout the Arab world as a result, has been unprecedented, to the extent that the Universal House of Justice wrote a few weeks ago to some of the Arab countries, stating that since the days of Abdul Baha, the proclamation in the Arab world we have had last year as a result of the persecution of the Friends in Egypt has been unprecedented. Some of the statistics I remember was there was one day, on the 16th of May, on one day, we had 36 articles in the Arab newspapers about the faith. Admittedly, half of it, or more than half, fierce attack, but a good number of them, were very positive. There was one particular article that the tone of it was interesting. A young Arab journalist in the Gulf wrote and said, "These days everyone talks about the Baha'is, and often we are negative about these Baha'is. And so I decided to go and read the book." And he said, "I have read the book." He mentioned the name. The name was the Prosperity for Mankind. He said, "I have read this book, and I have found in it solutions to every problem we have in Bahrain. And I want to recommend the study of this book to everyone." This is how really very simple, very genuine. Between the middle of May, the second half of May, in the period of 15 days, we had more than 20,000 visits to our Arabic website from Egypt alone. This is beyond any experience that we have had. During the same period, we had more than 5,000 copies of the Kitab Aqdas in Arabic downloaded in Egypt. Or at least attempt was made to download. We couldn't differentiate because we couldn't differentiate between whether they were successful or not. But friends, even if half of them were successful, this is far beyond what we could do to import Kitab Aqdas in Arabic into Egypt and sell it. So really these days, as in Persian say, one eye is weeping and one eye is happy. On one side, you see how our dearly loved friends in Iran and Egypt are suffering. On the other hand, we see the effect of it. We see these promises being fulfilled. The beloved guardian says that the resistless march of the cause of Baha'u'llah is propelled by stimulating influences, which the unwisdom of its enemies and the force latent within itself both engender. In other words, a combination of the unwisdom of the enemies of the faith, and the latent force within the faith generate energy and propel the progress of the cause of God. Now, recently, the story of the arrest of the 54 youth in Iran, in Shiraz. You probably have read about it. These were 54 Baha'i youth, age, I believe, 16, 17 to 25, 26 years old. They were assisting and tutoring secondary school classes in an unprivileged part of Shiraz. They were helping the children in this part of Shiraz to be better students. They were arrested and they were asked to sign a paper, something that they never accepted to do, that they will never do such a things again. They will never help people again. So the unwisdom of the enemies, by arresting them and demanding this, with the forces within the faith, really resulted in unprecedented proclamations throughout the faith. Doors never opened before, opened for the protection and the defense of the faith. Shoghi Effendi also says that the voice of criticism is a voice that indirectly reinforces the proclamation of its cause. And again, the part of the reason for this success, I think, in what we had in Egypt was this bitter, angry criticism of the faith by the clergy in the Al-Azhar University. And it was interesting stories that we heard from how that particular criticism attracted people to investigate the faith. One of the Baha'is who appeared on the screen facing these angered enemies of the faith said that the following day after the investigation, he went to a shop to buy something, groceries. And the shopkeeper recognized him and said, "Are you the one who appeared in the screen?" He said, "Yes." He said, and he had a lot of shopping. He said, "I will let you go without paying if you only sit down and tell me more about the Baha'i faith." In the same statement, Shoghi Effendi confirms that the conflicts and clashes between the faith and the entrenched orthodoxy of the past will cause the eventual ascendancy of the faith. Here is what he says: "For we know that our beloved faith must eventually clash with the entrenched orthodoxies of the past, and that this conflict cannot but lead to greater victories and to ultimate emancipation, recognition, and ascendancy." Now, if you think of the history of the faith in Iran, in the past 160 years, persecution has continued. Enemies of the faith, to a great extent, have really succeeded in creating some sort of, if you like, hate in the hearts of some people towards the Baha'is and the Baha'i faith, to the extent that until recently it was almost a taboo for anyone to even mention the name of the faith in a public place, in the fear that maybe they will be painted or they will be colored with the same hate or for the same disregard. But things are changing. According to a Persian human rights group based in Sweden, this hate is now changing into curiosity, they call it. People are now becoming curious to learn about the faith. And so you can see, though it has taken a long time, but it's moving. And one can see that with a bit of more progress in this, the days will come, or at least we can see the dawn of the days when recognition of the faith can be discussed. And once that is achieved, then the acceptance of the faith and its ascendancy is going to be achieved. So the promises of God will all be achieved. It just takes longer than what we like it to be. Friends, I am getting nervous because time is running out and I have more things to say. The effect of opposition on the community, let me just share this with you. They, the adversaries, will purge the faith, Shoghi Effendi says, from those pernicious elements whose continued association with the believers tend to discredit the fair name of the cause and to tarnish the purity of its spirit. So it is a means of purging, purifying our community as well. Now I promise that I will share with you some of the promises of victory. The famous quotations of Abdul Baha, where he talked about the enemies of the faith from Africa and Europe and China and all will arise. That statement is followed by this. Then, he says, shall the knights of the Lord, assisted by his grace from on high, strengthened by faith, aided by the power of understanding, and reinforced by the legions of the covenant, arise and make manifest the truth of this verse. Behold the confusion that has befallen the tribes of the defeated. On another occasion, he says, the Heavenly Father will illumine you to such an extent that like unto the rays of the sun, you shall scatter the dark clouds of superstition, shine gloriously in the midst of heaven, and illumine the face of the earth. When Shoghi Effendi talked about the Baha'i faith suffering more serious oppositions than other religions of God, that statement is followed by this promise. He says, unlike those religions, however, these tribulations have failed utterly to impair its unity, the unity of the Baha'i faith, or to create even temporarily a branch in the ranks of its adherent. It has not only survived these ordeals, but has emerged purified and inviolate, endowed with greater capacity to face and surmount any crisis which its resistless march may engender in the future. So in the first 100 years of the faith, Shoghi Effendi says the suffering that and the persecution that the Baha'is have gone through has actually enabled it and has proven its ability to stand the future oppositions. So regardless of what comes in the future, we have the promise that we will go through it successfully. Shoghi Effendi, talking about Persia being the first to repress and oppose the faith, points out that how, because of this, its monarchs had miserably fallen, their dynasty had collapsed, their names was execrated, the hierarchy that had been their ally and had propped their declining state had been utterly discredited. So this is some of the ways and means. Not only God has the power to change opposition into an oil, but it also promises what will happen to the enemies of the faith. They would be discredited. Here is another more powerful promise from Baha'u'llah. He says, should the continued existence of anyone be detrimental to the interest of the cause of God, the Almighty will undoubtedly lay hold on him as he has in the past. No one has fathomed nor can fathom his transcendent wisdom. And Shaykh Effendi has actually written quite a few pages in the God Passes By about the fate of the enemies of the faith, trying to really demonstrate for us how this promise of Baha'u'llah has already been fulfilled to some extent. And with this last quote, I will end this section of the promise of victory and how God watches over his faith and over all of us who are the defenders of his cause. He says, I swear by the day star of the heaven of utterance, were the oppressors to be apprised of the just requital that awaiteth them, for the least words of scorn hurled at the loved ones of God, they would, one and all, betake themselves to the wilderness, and weeping and lamenting would implore pardon from him who is the desire of the world. If you don't mind, I wanted to read this in Persian, in origin Persian, because it is more powerful than for the benefits of those who understand Persian. He says, قسم به آفتاب افق بیان که اگر نفوس ظالمه از جزای یک حرف صغیره که استهزاء لاحباء الله گفته‌اند مطلع شوند، جمیع سر به بیابان گذارند و به نوحه و ندبه طلب عفو از مقصود عالمیان نمایند. Let me just read it once more for you in English. I swear by the day, this was my favorite one of all these quotations. I swear by the day star of the heaven of utterance, were the oppressors to be apprised of the just requital that awaiteth them, for the least word of scorn hurled at the loved ones of God, they would one and all betake themselves to the wilderness, and weeping and lamenting would implore the pardon from him who is the desire of the world. So friends, with all this, what the opposition is and what effect it has, and the faith of God cannot progress without it, the question of what should be our attitude towards it, it becomes simpler. Don't we want some opposition? Of course we want. But should we ask for it? No. Shaykh Effendi says, we should, far from regarding any manifestation of hostility as an evidence of the weakening of the pillars of the faith, acclaim it as both a God-sent gift and a God-sent opportunity, which, if we remain undaunted, we can utilize for the furtherance of his faith. God-sent gift and God-sent opportunity. We should welcome, therefore, not only the open attacks which it its enemies persistently launch against it, but should also view as a blessing in disguise every storm of mischief with which they who apostatize their faith or claim to be its faithful exponents assail it from time to time. We should welcome it and see it as a blessing in disguise, both external oppositions and internal oppositions. There is a lot of also advice as how do we have to face oppositions. We should face it with firmness, of course, in the covenant, with love, with benevolence, with let me share with you, I will skip the others, but let me just share with you the quotations from the House of Justice, which really encompasses the other statements that I wanted to share with you. The House of Justice in 1983 wrote to a National Spiritual Assembly and said this: in meeting attacks, the friends should learn to combine the spirit of steadfastness and courage with love and wisdom. They should avoid argument and conflict and conduct themselves in such manner that they do not provoke retaliation. Hostility to the faith is something all Baha'is can expect. How we react to it is of great importance. You are urged to avoid confrontation and dissension, as these would tend to increase the antagonism. Maintain a dignified and friendly attitude. So do not invite opposition, but when it comes, in fact, Abdul Baha says, look at it as the play of children. It's not important. Don't pay attention to it. You do your responsibility. But combine wisdom, love, and courage. So, friends, the history of our faith is full of crises, also full of victories. And we know how the beloved guardian explains that the progress of the cause comes in cycles of crisis and victories. In preparation for my talk, and thinking that I will have time to dwell on crisis and victories, I don't. I actually thought of the past 160 years of the history of the faith, and without really doing any thorough research, from what I could remember, I divided the history into the first 25, 30 years, then into two periods of 50 years each, and then the last 30 years. That makes about 160 years. And in each, I tried to remember what has been the major persecutions, the major difficulties that the faith has suffered from, and what were the victories. And first, I wanted to actually present this tonight, but it was getting too long and I had to cut things, so I cut this. But I invite you, if you haven't done this, just do this exercise. It is a fascinating picture and pattern that emerges. And it clearly shows the concept of crisis and victories. But for these crises and victories to work, friends, of course we have to have our faith had to be strong. We have to have confidence in the confirmations of God, but we also have to have the right attitude towards opposition, and we have to actually be very watchful of the conditions and make sure that at every one time we do our best to serve the cause, and in particular teach the cause. I'm mostly referring to the countries where the faith is under persecution and teaching the cause is difficult. And sometimes you see the friends, on one hand, especially when the persecution prolongs for many, many decades, it is difficult for the friends, on one hand, to see the result of their suffering. Sometimes the result of the suffering is the progress of the faith elsewhere, but it's difficult for them to see. On the other hand, as one way of coping with the difficulties, they adopt a different way of serving the cause, a different way of teaching the cause. Sometimes they become more inward-looking. And over the years, the pattern of teaching changes. And I think one can say that as it prolongs, they actually get used to what they have been doing for many years under persecution, that even when new opportunities come, they don't necessarily recognize. They don't necessarily realize that now the time has come to now behave like the time of victory before the new cycle of crisis arises. And so under these circumstances, the friends need and can do with any amount of encouragement and guidance from the institutions of the faith to assist them to realize their circumstances, as to know that things are changing and they need to adapt to the new circumstances. And as I said, behave at the time of victory like a victorious person and not someone who is still in crisis. One of the Baha'is in Morocco was telling me that he said, sometimes when I think of the situation in Morocco, it's like of the Baha'is, is like someone who has been beaten very hard on his head, and as a defense, he has covered his head and he can't see what's happening around him because he has been beaten all the time. So the one who has been beating us has gone, but we are still holding our head down, and we don't dare raise our head to see things have changed. Sometimes the Baha'is, out of their deep desire to obey as a way of obedience to the government, they also read into the limitations more than what the limitations are, and they are not able to do what they can. The very same person was telling me that he thinks that the situation, this is a few years ago, things are better now, that in Morocco he said, I feel the government has closed the door to us, but in our obedience we have also locked the door and thrown away the key. So sometimes we are more anxious to even further our own limitations. So this whole concept of crisis and victories is a very interesting subject of discussion. What I want to tell you is that the latest guidances of the Universal House of Justice to the Baha'is of Iran and the Arab countries has been for them to realize their circumstances and meditate on this and think about it and realize and examine the possibilities for service to the cause and for new ways of teaching the cause. So, if we have the right attitude towards opposition, then perseverance is what we are expected to do. Shoghi Effendi says, to try to persevere is to ensure ultimate and complete victory. Baha'u'llah, to one of the friends who suffered with him, says, grieve not at what has befallen us and thee in the path of God. Rest assured and persevere. What helps us to persevere, of course, is faith, confidence in the final victory, total reliance on confirmation from on high, but also an appreciation of the role each one of us can play in the progress of the cause. That confidence that I'm talking about is, when I think of the confidence, the spirit of Mullah Hussein comes to me. He had total confidence and reliance on God to start off this whole process. When the story of greatest holy leaf asking Varga, the martyr, the 12-year-old martyr, asking him, what would you do if you are told that the Mahdi has come now. This is during the days of the greatest holiday. And Ruhollah said, I will go and teach him the cause of God. When you think of these days a tutor who goes to a D cluster, a cluster with no Baha'i, but has perseverance, has confidence, and in a matter of 2 years to 3 years, he is able to assist to establish a Baha'i community and help that Baha'i community to reach a stage of development where they can launch their first intensive program of growth. This is that combination of faith, perseverance, and confidence. So friends, for the protection of the faith, every living organism has a system, a mechanism for defense. Plants, animals, and human beings alive. Faith is a growing thing, so it does have a defense mechanism. This by itself is another vast subject that one can talk about, and I'm not going to talk about the details of it. But embedded in the faith is a wonderful, complex mechanism for the defense of the faith, which allows both spiritual forces and the efforts of individuals and institutions of the faith to work together for the advancing the interests of the faith. As individuals, the best we can do to protect the faith is to teach the cause and help to spread it. The best we can do to protect the cause is to assist the processes of the 5-year plan to become stronger and stronger in more and more clusters throughout the world. Almost a handful of individuals today throughout the world are sufficient to do the specialized aspect of the protection of the cause. That is our external affairs. And we have, in the words of the House of Justice today, a process that began from the days of the Guardian and later on under the guidance of the House of Justice. We now have an extensive external system capable of both defending the interest of the faith and proclaiming its universal message. We have that. So what we need, every Baha'i can do to protect the faith, as I mentioned, is to assist with the progress of the 5-year plan. And why? This is my understanding, and I'll share it with you. In the past, as a result of the spiritual energies released through the sufferings of the friends in Iran, Egypt, elsewhere in the past 25-30 years, combined with the experience that the Baha'is have gained in the past 30-40 years of trying to find ways and means of spreading the faith of Baha'u'llah throughout the world, it has become possible for the House of Justice to proclaim to the world that now we have a framework for action for advancing the process of entry by troops. And that frame of action now needs to be explored. Through these processes, I will paraphrase the words of the House of Justice, we can demonstrate to the world that Baha'u'llah is the only one who can bestow the very bounties that the people of the world are waiting for, are searching for. And Baha'u'llah is the only one who can assist them to build the very society they desire to have. And I assure you, this is the best protection we can provide for the faith for facing the attacks of its enemies. Something that every Baha'i can do. At the Baha'i World Center, we have, I think, twofold responsibility. On one hand, we have to recognize, in my opinion, try to recognize more and more, day by day, the significance of the opportunity given to us to serve at the Baha'i World Center and to render our services while here with efficiency, diligence, and with highest regard for the sanctity of the surrounding in which we are privileged to serve. And secondly, is through participating in the serving of the divine plan activities, prepare ourselves to join our comrades, Baha'is, brothers and sisters throughout the world in furthering the interests of the 5-year plan as a way of assisting with the protection. I'm sorry it took longer than what I had planned, but let me just end with two quotations, brief quotations from Shoghi Effendi and one short prayer from Baha'u'llah. In one of these quotations, Shoghi Effendi says, "Whatever our shortcomings may be, and however formidable the forces of darkness which besieges us today, the unification of mankind, as outlined and ensured by the world order of Baha'u'llah, will in the fullness of time be firmly and permanently established. This is Baha'u'llah's promise, and no power on earth can in the long run present or ever retard its adequate realization. The friends should therefore not lose hope, but fully conscious of their power and their role, they should persevere in their mighty efforts for the extension and the consolidation of Baha'u'llah's universal dominion on earth." And then he says, "Dearly beloved friends, upon us devolves the supreme obligation to stand by his side, to fight his battles, and to win his victories. May we prove ourselves worthy of this trust." And I'm sure you all know this prayer of Baha'u'llah, where he says, "Armed with the power of thy name, nothing can ever hurt me, and with thy love in my heart, all the world's affliction can in no wise alarm." God bless you. Thank you.